presentation. Thank you, whoever caught that. I even put a thing up here that said record, and so still managed to miss that. All right, so we're going to have Alex give a short presentation which kind of summarizes his work, and then we're going to go to the committee for some questions. Alex, we can hold our questions to the end of your presentation, or we can allow questions during the presentation, but I would rather go with your preference.
I would hold them till the end. We'll do that.
Yeah, good. So we'll have our questions after the presentation, and then we'll open it to the room in case anybody wants to comment a bit further. Then the committee will finalize our decision. So hopefully a nice relaxed meeting. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Alex. I'm going to hand the control over to you at this point.
Thank you, Holly. All right, let's get started then. As would be typical. All right, well, everybody, welcome to the oral defense of my dissertation entitled Formulating a Regulatory Stance, the Comparative Politics of E-Cigarette Regulation in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. I want to welcome my committee chairs, Holly Jarman and Scott Greer, and my other committee members, Daniel Valand and Paula Lance. And before we get started, in today's presentation to my wife, Lindsay, and to my daughter, Sophia. You guys put up with this project for ages, and I'm so proud to present it today. Lindsay tolerated me leaving for fieldwork for 2 months in the middle of her second trimester, so any credit I get needs to be given doubly to her. To my friends, family, colleagues, and mentors on and off the Zoom room, this would not have been possible without you either. I have had a truly privileged path towards the completion of this degree, and you all made it worthwhile. Now, onto the work of the dissertation. E-cigarettes were invented in China in 2003 as a substitute for tobacco cigarettes. These electronic devices heat a nicotine-laced solution into an aerosol which is inhaled by users. These products are widely agreed to be less hazardous to health than tobacco cigarettes. However, exactly how much less risky e-cigarettes are remains subject to debate. The effects of the e-cigarette market on driving tobacco cigarette initiation and quitting complicate this subject further, and leading professional opinion over the e-cigarette's net effects on the public health to be split into those who believe the product is a blessing, those who believe it is a curse, and those who believe it is somewhere in between. This disagreement over the effect is that countries have adopted towards this novel market. While almost every country has agreed to take concrete regulatory policy action to decrease the size of the tobacco cigarette market, by contrast, e-cigarette regulatory policy choices diverge wildly in approach, purpose, and goals. This has resulted in the UK placing vape shops in hospitals, while the Philippines arrests vapers for vaping in designated smoking areas. When we look at a world map of the distribution of countries that ban versus those who regulate the legal sale of e-cigarettes, no obvious explanation of the divergence rises to the fore. In this dissertation, I sought to improve on prior work by structuring an analysis around a generalizable organizing concept for market regulatory policies. Here, I take economists at their word that markets must be regulated to resolve market failures. I argue that any market failure has an implicit remedy via policy that intends to alter the size of a given market. I use a refinement of political scientist Robert Paarlberg's framework, developed to describe diverging regulatory policy towards genetically modified foods, that I refer to as the range of regulatory stances. The primary measure used to determine a regulatory stance of a given jurisdiction towards a given market is the intended size of a market as a share of an economy in the future compared to the present. I argue that a regulatory stance can be determined for any market in any jurisdiction at any time. Placing regulatory policies on this range of regulatory stances enables us to directly observe policy convergence and divergence across time and place. The range of regulatory stances extends from prohibitionist stances, which aim to decrease a market size to zero, all the way to universalist, which seeks to expand a market to the largest extent possible. I believe that most markets are typically subject to a regulatory stance in between these extremes, wherein some markets receive a contractionist stance that seeks to decrease the size of a market, while others are subject to an expansionist stance that seeks to increase the size of a market. Other markets are not subject to a size preference and are deemed subject to a permissive stance. With that organizing framework now in hand, we can now better ask the research question around which this study is framed. How and why do countries choose regulatory stances with respect to e-cigarette markets? I utilized a comparative case study design to answer this central question. First, I used a forward selection process to choose my countries of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand to focus my study on. These countries all began with the same prohibitionist e-cigarette regulatory policy. And while Australia stuck with that policy, New Zealand and Canada changed course and adopted expansionist stances. They are all highly developed, transparent, consolidated parliamentary democracies outside of the European Union.
Alex, I think you've frozen. I can see other people moving, but not you. Oh dear. Can I ask people in the to turn off their video to try and reduce the stress on the... Hey Alex, can you hear us now? Because I can see you moving again. Good.
Hear me?
I can hear you now, Alex. Are you okay? Don't panic.
All right. All right, let's try it again. Okay. Initially, I collected and analyzed publicly available documents from policy sources, parliamentary debates, bureaucratic procedures, news articles, and the scientific literature. Then, I began my fieldwork with semi-structured key informant then divided into its respective location in John Kingdon's multiple streams approach. The organizing concept for the, did I freeze again?
Very slightly, Alex, but I think you can keep going.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. The organizing concept, so John Kingdon's multiple streams approach is the organizing concept. Kingdon posits that actions in broadly independent streams must collide to produce change. A salient problem must bubble up in the metaphorical problem stream. That problem should be able to be addressed by a feasible policy solution dreamed up and promoted to the top in the policy stream. Both problem and policy must be commensurate with the political environment if that policy is to be put in examining why regulatory stances towards e-cigarettes changed or stay the same. So this is my effort to sum up my findings in a really succinct manner. I'll cover as much important material as I can across 3 case studies with 3 streams in each and many explanatory variables covering events stretching over a decade. Here, I'll summarize each country's initial and final and regulatory stances and what factors drove events towards change or stasis. Australia is to maintain a prohibitionist regulatory stance towards nicotine-containing e-cigarettes, which are classified as dangerous poisons. Their initial and final regulatory framework for nicotine-containing e-cigarettes was made up of 2 potential pathways, illustrated here, for similarly situated products. The default pathway was to classify the products as poisons because they contain nicotine. The products could also be placed on a pathway as a therapeutic if they receive pre-market approval from the medicines regulator, if safety, efficacy, and quality could be proven. If an e-cigarette had been approved as a therapeutic, the products would have received many advantages over tobacco cigarettes, up to and including being fully subsidized for purchase. However, no e-cigarette ever received such an approval. Therefore, all products were subject to a series of prohibitionist policies, which has worked to keep the market for e-cigarettes rather small in Australia. Australia maintains this regulatory framework to this day, having fought off several attempts at changing the stance via an appeal to the medicines regulator and a parliamentary inquiry. Australia was able to maintain its stance because no problem serious enough to policymakers and public health policy advocates to question the current regulatory framework ever rose to prominence, largely because tobacco control in the country was viewed as a success. Those few pro-tobacco harm reduction policy entrepreneurs, or those who are promoting e-cigarettes to be grown as a market, sought to try to move policy change forward, ended up partnering with tobacco company interests and damaged their reputations in the process. While these policy entrepreneurs found sympathetic politicians who would run with their ideas, their base never expanded beyond the extreme right wing. The left wing of Australian politics took their cues from public health actors and constantly opposed changing e-cigarette policy, favoring e-cigarette regulatory as a starting point. In Canada, I must emphasize that those countries' initial regulatory frameworks for nicotine-containing e-cigarettes were nearly identical to Australia's. Can you all still hear me?
I can still hear you, Alex, but I can still see your Australia slide.
Well, I'm not on the next one yet, so we're good. In Canada, after the passage of e-cigarette regulatory reform bill S5, e-cigarettes received an expansionist regulatory stance with distinct advantages over the tobacco cigarette market in marketing, pricing, and product standards. Canada began its journey to this point around 2009, when the omnibus health regulator, Health Canada, attempted to enforce a law prohibiting the sale of nicotine products without prior approval of the regulator. Vape shops laughed off this threat, and eventually Health Canada stopped enforcing their prohibitionist policy. Canadian bureaucrats chose to back off strictly enforcing their initial prohibition on the sale of e-cigarettes with nicotine because they saw such efforts as diverting resources from more consequential actions. They reasoned that the products were not killing anyone, so they wouldn't rush to crack down. In the absence of such action, the e-cigarette market grew into a gray market of substantial size as vape shops spread across Canada. The growing market and its consumers created a demand for instituting some basic regulations, first over marketing and public use, which were the responsibility of provinces, so not the federal government, to address. This triggered provincial ministers of health to ask the federal government to fill the vacuum in guidance. The federal bureaucracy and civil society reached a consensus alternative regulatory framework for e-cigarettes that increased the power of bureaucrats and granted select competitive advantages to e-cigarettes over tobacco cigarettes. When all political parties signed on to a unanimous House Health Committee report outlining the principles that should underlie an e-cigarette regulatory framework, the fate of e-cigarette regulation was effectively sealed. After the passage of Bill S5, trouble with youth usage of e-cigarettes led to some of the initial advantages granted to the e-cigarette market being clawed back by subsequent federal regulations and provincial laws. But overall, the market still receives an expansionist regulatory stance. New Zealand has had a regulatory framework for e-cigarettes. Currently New Zealand has a regulatory framework for e-cigarettes being considered for passage before Parliament as a part of an official government bill. The bill adopts what the Kiwis call a risk proportionate approach by providing e-cigarettes with competitive advantages over tobacco cigarettes in the domains of reaching this point in New Zealand was driven by a push to address what were widely perceived to be failures in tobacco control policy. The country's smoke-free 2025 endgame target was thought to be ambitious. 3 times higher.
A little bit.
We lost it?
I just need the last sentence again. So sorry.
That's okay. The country's smoke-free 2025 endgame target was thought to be ambitious at the time of its adoption, but progress towards achieving the goal of reaching 5% adult smoking prevalence is truly underwhelming, particularly among the indigenous Maori, who smoke tobacco at a rate 3 times higher than New Zealanders of European descent. To redress this disparity and to make some desperately wanted progress, a certain openness to trying new strategies has persisted in the New Zealand public health community. This openness to change was intensified once a court ruled the prior prohibitionist framework was invalid. Rather than put the old framework back into place, the policy community coalesced around an alternative regulatory stance towards e-cigarettes. The New Zealand public health community has actively sought common ground with those who hold more skeptical views towards tobacco harm reduction and has made a point of excommunicating loudly and publicly any member that becomes too cozy with tobacco companies. A consensus view that the presence of legal e-cigarettes on the market would enable enacting harsher contractionist policies on tobacco cigarettes enabled almost all public health policy community members to agree that an expansionist regulatory stance towards e-cigarettes was preferable to the status quo. The political situation was favorable to delayed, if moderate, change as New Zealand's mixed member proportional representational system first produced a right-wing government that favored adopting an expansionist e-cigarette regulatory stance, and then was replaced by a coalition left-wing government that eventually saw the same expansionist stance as acceptable. When everyone agreed on the direction to take regulatory policy, change was no longer a political liability. So what did I learn after all this? Well, I can structure those lessons with John Kingdon's policy or multiple streams approach. So in the policy stream, I found that 2 explanatory factors played important roles in precipitating change or maintaining stasis in regulatory policy. New Zealand's change was actively precipitated by a rising collective dissatisfaction with tobacco control policy progress being made towards the smoke-free 2025 goal. In Australia, no such end-game goal existed, and no effective mechanism to highlight extant disparities existed either. The other factor of rejecting the regulatory stance played a pivotal role to starting reform in Canada, and to a different extent in New Zealand. Once the bureaucracy abandoned the prohibitionist policy, a problem was created that had to be solved. In Australia, bureaucrats have faithfully enforced prohibitions on sale and imports of e-cigarettes with nicotine, ensuring that the regulatory stance itself did not become discongruent with reality. In the policy stream, the most consequential explanatory factor was the ability of the public health policy community to reach consensus on an alternative regulatory stance to the status quo. Once prohibitionist stances were abandoned by the bureaucracy, public health policy communities in Canada and New Zealand were able to reach agreement that expansionist regulatory stances towards e-cigarettes were preferable to the status quo. Finally, in the politics stream, only left-wing party support proved to be a consequential factor in explaining the policy change in stasis. Left parties always sided with the public health policy community, so reaching consensus on an alternative and expansionist regulatory stance was required for left parties to adopt those positions. However, once left-wing parties abandoned their support for prohibitionist policies, right-wing parties were provided with a permission structure to support a change in the regulatory stance. So why should anyone prefer to talk about regulatory stances in their own work? Well, I believe the regulatory stances concept provides certain advantages to scholars and advocates for policy reform alike by focusing studies on the goal of regulation, rather than what I believe to be less consequential or comparable features of policy. A regulatory stance can be determined for almost any market, which then enables valuable comparative regulatory studies across time, place, and market. By focusing on goals, the regulatory stances concept might push for emphasizing what I call powerful policies over comprehensive policies. And when addressing large societal troubles, that may be an asset instead of a liability. Finally, the regulatory stance concept could unlock the potential of the burgeoning discussions around the importance of commercial determinants of health by freeing such important discussions from the shadow of tobacco control and opening discussions that plot large-scale changes in the markets that inflict harm because they are too big or too small. So with that, I want to acknowledge the people who helped me get to the end of this dissertation. It was a long journey, but I have to thank my family, so Lindsay, Sophia, Mom, Dad, Chad, Olivia, Max, Julian, and Grandma Audrey, Papa Ernie, and my Atlanta family with Tony and Lisa Suarez and Jessica Suarez. So I want to say you all were the village that helped raise me and helped raise this dissertation. So I also want to thank particularly my early scientific mentors. That would be from Penny Koba, who started me on the science research track in high school, to Amy Furkadich, who invited me into her lab and humored me when she thought that public health epidemiologists had labs, and who got me started on tobacco control research all these 12 years ago. That would also include Ken Warner, who eventually persuaded me to come to Michigan, and I have enjoyed my time at U of M immensely, and his contribution to shaping my career has been consequential. To my American Cancer Society colleagues, from Rito John, Hannah Ross, and Evan Pletcher, who started me out into back into global tobacco control. You guys set the pace to get me going in this direction. Jeff Drope, Michal Stoklosa, Zach Kahn, Nigar Nargis, and Jing Lee have helped me build this to where it was today. And of course, Cliff Douglas, who wore dual hats with me at ACS for some time and helped mentor me in so many ways. To Holly and Scott and Daniel and Paula, you guys made, well, Holly and Scott in particular, made my education what it was, and I'm so proud that I've been able to come through my years at Michigan, learning so much and having developed as a scholar. And Daniel and Paula, I really value all the work you guys put into helping me here and for getting me out of some sticky situations with the committee membership. And then there's a long list of fieldwork enablers who I really can't, I would want to say, particularly to Ryan Kennedy and Joanna Cohen for kicking off this project, to Jane Banashak Hall and Jackie Drope for sheltering me when I was far from home. And then to my HSOP friends, particularly Brady Post and Michael Rubion, for being my friends, being my colleagues, being my peers, and going on with my cohort of Mina and June and Wei Fen, my mentors like Charlie and Phil Singer, is on and on. I've had so much help getting here, and it wouldn't have been possible without all of you. So with that, here's some pictures and notes from the field of a particular wonderful Canadian delicacy called the beaver tail, which I was able to share with Jackie Drope in Ottawa. I take this little dinosaur with me on my travels, and his name is Ike, and he's got to now visit every single continent. And so these are two of his pictures with Smaug the dragon from Lord of the Rings when we were in New Zealand, and where he got to meet a panda, sorry, not a panda, goodness, a koala in Brisbane, Australia. So that's what I've got. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm ready for next part of the defense. Holly?
Oh, Alex, you're making me emotional already when I'm supposed to be an impartial judge. So everybody, let's take a moment to unmute ourselves and just give Alex a round of applause. Thank you for your presentation. Yeah.
Way to go, Alex.
Well done, especially I know it's hard to do this with audio interruptions and other things, so good job. All right. I'm going to keep my video off for now. I'm going to turn to the committee at this point. If you're in the audience, I'd appreciate it if you could remute yourself and turn your video off, just so that we don't get more connection issues. But feel free to also add things in the chat. I will take a look at that. So we're going to have questions from the committee members first, and I'd like to start with Paula Lance, if that's okay.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone, and hi, Alex.
Hi, Paula.
What a special and exciting day. And I want to start first by saying congratulations on a very ambitious, well-written, and impressive dissertation. Just kudos to you. What an incredible undertaking you did for a dissertation, and you pulled it all together. It really was easy to read and a pleasure to read, and I learned a lot from it, and I'm just really proud of you, and really privileged to be on your committee today. That said, I do have a couple of questions I want to ask you. It's part of the rite of passage, but also I have a couple of questions I want to ask you. So the first one really has to do with methods. So you collected a lot of data from a lot of different sources in your 3 countries. A lot of document review, as well as an amazing number of semi-structured interviews. And actually in chapter 3, you describe your semi-structured interviews as the centerpiece of your data collection. What I didn't see in your methods chapter of your dissertation is what so you did the semi-structured interview, like how did you actually organize and treat the interview responses as data? Right? So how did you record your interviews and then have transcripts? Did you actually go through and do qualitative analyses, pulling out themes? Again, I want to hear a little bit more from you, and then I actually did want to see a little bit more in your methods section about how you actually went from the interviews, took that as data, analyzed that data, and then integrated it with all of your document review work.
That's a very good question. So the way that I treated the interviews was I worked off of a common script on, I think, 90% of a common interview structure on 90% of the interviews, asking the same questions. So what I did was recorded them, then they were transcribed using this artificial intelligence program called Trint, and then it produced such an overwhelming amount of data. With 100 interviews over like averaging in 40 minutes each, it eventually became really difficult to write this and do the proper qualitative coding on everything. So what probably needs to be done going forward is looking at all of the questions that I asked simultaneously. So one of the questions was, is tobacco control a success in your country? And I think what's missing right now from the dissertation is like the real reported results where New Zealanders said constantly they weren't satisfied, whereas Australians said they were very, very satisfied with the way that tobacco control was going in their country, and Canadians were definitely towards the New Zealand end. And so what is probably missing from it right now is doing that particular thematic extraction, or at least counting up where when I asked yes and no questions, what was the breakdown of that. So it's essentially not there right now, and mostly it was used to, the interview data has been used to bolster the story and to fill in the gaps in what's not in the public record, and to confirm what was going on behind the scenes. So to make your question short, there's a lot of data there, and it needs to be perhaps better integrated into some thematic analysis, or at least tabulated for certain answers, perhaps in revisions or when this becomes a manuscript. Yeah.
Sure.
And I mean, something at this point, because Alex, you're selling yourself short.
Yeah.
In terms of what you did. You did do thematic analysis. You immersed yourself in the data, which is what you should do by going through the interviews multiple times, reading them through. And you also were writing all the time, like small memos, collective responses to the interviews. So to my mind, you did need to do a better job of reporting the things that you actually did, and don't undersell yourself that way. So sorry for the interjection, but
Thanks. And Holly's been closer to you in this journey than I have, but that I was going to guess that's exactly what happened. I mean, it's always the case. You always gather, or oftentimes gather way more data than you actually, report in a single paper or even in a 253-page dissertation. That's going to make a fantastic book. So, I mean, it's great that you have additional insights and data that you could use going forward. I think you do in your chapter, and I think this will take you a hot, 20 minutes or 30 minutes to do, but I would like to see, just for the record, a bit more detail about how you actually did use and analyze the semi-structured interviews. Because I do think they did play an important role. So just being a little more explicit about your methods in that regard will be helpful.
I can do that.
Okay. And then I have another question I'll ask, and then I'll be quiet for a while maybe. So we just talked about methods, and then I also want to talk about another, standard thing that's really important in research, and that's generalizability or external validity. So, I like your regulatory stance framework and agree with all the things you just said in the dissertation in your presentation. I think this really obviously can be applied to all kinds of regulatory decisions. It's a very useful framework for comparative politics and policy analysis. So, I mean, that's great. I want to instead talk about the generalizability of your findings, and not so much like, well, how can you generalize the findings from these 3 countries to other countries? No, that's not the question. The question is, can you generalize what you found about this specific disruptive technology of e-cigarettes within these 3 countries to perhaps other kinds of disruptive technologies? I mean, you could think about autonomous vehicles or 3D printing or retail medical clinics or even, COVID-related public health regulations. But do you think there's anything you learned from this deep dive analysis within each of these countries that might help predict or be able to be generalized to other regulatory decisions that have been made by each of these 3 countries?
I think that the Kingdonian multiple streams framework has it really guides this sort of how I go about thinking about external generalizability. So particularly the creation of problems and then how policy communities respond to it was, I think, the thing that will generalize within countries best. So in Canada, while e-cigarettes were being legalized, cannabis was being legalized for recreational purposes. And truthfully, it sucked up all the real energy in the room. But it followed the same pattern in the sense that when bureaucrats basically were frustrated primarily with the operation of the quasi-medical marijuana framework, they just decided we have to find an alternative that works better for us and that meets more of our goals. And so the process of public health policy communities coming together and sort of like advancing the kind of recreational marijuana market they wanted, along with the input of business interests and the way that political parties met them at how they would depart from a prohibitionist stance, was pretty similar in the sense that there was a problem that needed to be resolved. There was essentially no one willing to protect the old regulatory stance, and that's when people moved. That same thing is probably going to happen with other markets. So when it's not so much that I know what problem is going to tip the balance against resistance against autonomous vehicles. But I think what it shows is that when bureaucrats are willing to leave behind the old problem, and when everybody can agree that there is something better, it seems that we can leave prohibition behind. in terms of external generalizability, it's really a key thing I want to learn about, which is how do we get towards contraction from expansion? So there are the issues, of course, around alcohol and opioids and any other kind of like nuclear power. How on earth did we go from expansion all the way back to prohibition? I don't know how much my research says about what it takes to leave expansion behind, but I think the framework is the right way to put together and ask this question, because you're right, there's just a million different ways to take a good comparative regulatory framework and ask questions and do studies.
Great. All right, thank you so much.
Great, and now I'd like to move on and ask Daniel if he could ask any questions.
Of course, I can ask questions. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations, Alex, for reaching that stage. And it's a really strong piece of scholarship you produced, and I really enjoy reading it. And I think it has a great potential for in terms of publication as a book, and perhaps also a couple of journal articles. So let me ask, well, Paula asked about method, so I will ask maybe a bit about theory to, you know, have some diversity here in the conversation. So kingdom, first of all, I really like the concept of regulatory stance and the way you introduce it and the way you illustrate it, so that's really great. But regarding kingdom, you know, he was, of course, prof at the U of M for many years in political science, and his book, Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policies, and you draw extensively on it in your work, is only about the United States, right? And Kingdom was a specialist of US politics. And your work is comparative. It's not about the US. And I want to know, how do you move from, say, a framework that was developed in a specific country and without a comparative lens at all, and how do you move that and you use that in a comparative setting?
So, well, as the comparatives likes to say, they like to treat the American as like they just specialize in a single case. And I think that we can start there. So Kingdon did a great job explaining what he referred to as agenda setting in the American congressional context. Now, Congress operates very differently from parliaments, and especially Westminster parliaments, where there are not a lot of checks on power. So the way that a lot of people have gone about applying Kingdon abroad is by saying, well, agenda setting is really the same thing as making policy in a parliament, because if a bill comes up in parliament and it fails, that's the end of the government in a lot of circumstances. It's not necessarily perfectly so, but governments in parliament have that kind of agenda control. So the way that we move from useful American policy is to sort of see its components and see how does it scale up or scale down or transfer into other situations. I would argue Kingdon scales down very well. You can use it in literally, how does an organization solve a particular problem? It was developed from garbage can theory, as you know, which had lots of roots in the way operation of universities and how problems get solved. But essentially, Kingdon's bare components of a problem, a policy, and a politics need all align up before a window of opportunity for change can be opened, is a pretty scalable idea that can be identified in almost any situation if you're willing to if you're willing to relax some of the assumptions that these actors are independent, that they operate in the particular ways that Kingdon might have said, or that, and even that policy entrepreneurs might be different than the actors in other streams. They're not necessarily just reacting. They could be the same people if you're scaling it down far enough. So the way that it transfers is, one, by assuming America is just another case with its own particular peculiarities, and two, by collapsing agenda setting and policy making into kind of one frame, and three, by saying the essential components transfer, I'd say.
Thank you. I will now want to ask another theoretical question about kingdom, but this time more specific about your work and how you apply it. So you use, it's the multiple streams framework is quite broad and in a way flexible, and sometimes you can leave some parts, some concepts aside that might not be that helpful. But here you use some of the key concepts, of course, the 3 streams, focusing event, policy entrepreneur, but the key concept you don't mention once in the dissertation, although you talk about a few times window of opportunities, the concept of policy window, right? So I want to know, first of all, how do you define a policy window? What's the role of policy window within Kingdom framework, and why you decided not to use that concept explicitly in the dissertation?
So, I mean, a policy window is basically, it emphasizes what I think is the really useful part of Kingdom, which is that policy doesn't happen in cycles. It happens spontaneously when there's a collision of streams. So a policy window is that, theoretically, that bright shining moment when everything collides and aligns, and that policy change can happen. Now, I think that perhaps in the American context, it may be more important, especially in the congressional context, because things happen so slowly and really take extraordinary events to get things focused. He made that point about like the Affordable Care Act in 2010 being the product of the time and the problem and politics. So the reason that I didn't focus too much on policy windows is because I looked at the timeline of how my events played out, and they were long. So it stretched from Canada, like really hit what I call the focusing event for getting everything rolling in September 2014. The policy was really introduced to Parliament, so the key political events happened in about early 2015. The key policy introduction all happened in late 2016, and no policy was actually passed until May 2018. So it was a long time. And so to really emphasize that there was a bright shining moment where only this could have happened, it didn't necessarily feel right to me to say that this would have all fallen apart if they had waited, because it clearly didn't. And then the same thing happened in New Zealand again, where they were primed for policy change before the 2017 election that brought the Ardern coalition government to power. And then there was a focusing event in 2018 once the Ardern coalition had come to power that said that throughout the old regulatory framework. And then it took until February of 2020 to introduce the bill. So again, we had such a long time. No one rushed these bills into being. And that's just part of where I just think there wasn't a limited period, a limited window. And people maybe on this policy just had more patience to get things right. And there wasn't urgent problems necessarily beyond the malfunctioning of a regulatory framework that needed to be solved. This is in contrast to the EVALI outbreak of last fall in the United States and Canada, where people started dying from using tainted e-cigarettes, and the federal government and state governments like Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer decided they had to act very quickly and made policy choices that weren't the ones I would have made. But essentially, a problem showed up, policy entrepreneurs arrived, particularly from what I would assume be the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, saying you should ban flavored e-cigarettes because all these people are dying, but also kids are using e-cigarettes too much. And it was okay with the political moment from the right, the left. President Trump was on board with it until he wasn't. And like that, and it all went through at a bright, shining moment. And so I would call that more of a policy window rather than what these larger regulatory, changing the whole regulatory stance seems to be a larger undertaking, and it didn't seem to happen that quickly.
Thank you. That's interesting, because if we go back to the first question I asked about whether this framework can travel from the US to other countries in a comparative setting, what you're telling me in a way is that in the US, timing is even more important, and the concept of policy window by extension, than in other countries, because of checks and balances and the fact that it's so hard to get things done in the first place, right? Is it how we can understand this?
I certainly think that's a part of it, because the amount of veto players in the US make the political timing so much more complicated, especially for large federal policy change. It just doesn't happen that way. Maybe at the state level, it might be more similar, but with unified governments and supermajorities and sort of things like that, which will operate more like parliaments. But yeah, at the federal level, yeah, stars have to align.
All right, thank you very much. I'm done, at least for now.
Okay, great. And obviously, if anybody thinks of more questions on the committee, this is our time to ask. So we will circle back. I'm going to go to Scott now, because I feel like he probably also has something to say about Kingdon. So take it away, Scott.
Okay, and again, congratulations, Alex. This is a really good thesis. I kind of want to pick up the baton from Daniel on a couple of points. And the first one is kind of the more techie Kingdon one, which is, why do you talk so much about priming, and what does it add to your theoretical construct?
Priming in the media stream, or no, in the problem stream. So what does it add to the theoretical construct? So what priming would be, which would be the way that people describe a particular problem, and the words that they use for that. Or hold on, that's framing. What am I thinking? We'll run with that for a second. Basically, what the way that problems are framed often can imply solutions. And so when New Zealand in particular, say, encountered regulatory policy change, the whole thing was framed as a failure to redress health disparities. And so this meant they were looking to do something different, and it signaled dissatisfaction with the current regulatory stance. So the way that it wasn't that tweaks were needed or reform or small reforms were needed. They were literally trying to throw things out because they said that Maori were being ignored, killed, and left behind. And so when the policy came up, when the policy community arrived saying these sorts of things, it implied that a large departure was going to happen. And that meant they needed to have a change in the regulatory stance rather than simply a rethinking or a retweaking. So, and a similar language of frustration and we're wasting our time in Canada with enforcing the old policies. That also basically framed the definition of a problem. So what did it do? How did priming help in that sense? It implied that things were going to change if the right people got on board. So
I think Daniel and I actually have same side of the coin here, which is the typical use of Kingdon jumps on the window, and you used priming. And I think you might actually have come up with a comparative politics finding there, as Daniel said, that because of their structural differences between Westminster systems and the American system, where, as we know, anything working properly is unusual, that priming actually might carry more weight, because it's usually just kind of a descriptive term that doesn't carry a lot of weight when you're using it in American political context. It's a thing that happens. So I want to push on that a little bit, actually, which is, if I'm hearing this as a comparativist and I'm interested in understanding broadly why societies make and implement the decisions that they do, what's the advantage of using Kingdon? There's a lot of theories out there. Why Kingdon?
Well, Kingdon's useful because there's lots of ways to describe the policy process. There's your cycle theories, your advocacy coalition frameworks, but the multiple streams approach is really useful in describing the interrelationship between governments and advocates, and that it's not just a process of advocates badgering the government. It's able to really see the construction of problems and the way that solutions are put together and how those are sold and how how they're translated through the political process in a much more comprehensive way than, say, the advocacy coalition framework, which is usually like the alternative to Kingdon. It's also useful when, like, compared to the ACF, when actor preferences are unstable over time. So meaning when people don't have fixed views on issues like, you know, people's opinions on whether or not e-cigarettes are good have changed. We have that in particular bits of the data. People's opinions on, say, should the government allow abortion is usually a thing that is really fixed among actors for a long time. And that's particularly good with, like, the advocacy coalition framework, where they have the idea of core beliefs as really central to that. And this is, and your opinion on the kinds of e-cigarette flavors that should be allowed in the market is not a core belief to anyone. My beliefs have changed on that. Jacinda Ardern gave radio interviews saying her beliefs had changed on this, like, within the last few months before she put a bill on the table. And so, like, I think it's particularly useful to adapt to the vagaries of that. And then finally, the MSA is really good about the spontaneous events that drive policy. Like, we're living through COVID here. We're not doing this in person, and COVID has upended literally every kind of policy we could think of at every level. And it was spontaneous, and it focuses very well. It's not organized. It doesn't run in a process of a policy cycle of evaluation, implementation, and reflection. And so in some ways, it's just more realistic.
Okay, one last question, which is, one of the things you mentioned is that this allows us to back out information, you know, comparative learning about these different political systems. And so, you know, I'll be the political science cop here, along with Daniel, I guess. What have we learned about institutions? Because I'll pick out two to see if you've learned about whether and how much they mattered. One is federations, and the other is electoral systems, right? And these are go-to explanations of divergence. Did you learn anything that would be interesting to people who follow those topics?
So I can say that I learned more about the utility of election systems than federations. So federations theoretically are useful in the study of comparative regulation because they allow experimentation. Some powers are devolved, some are kept from the central government. So in the current case, I have two countries that are federal, so Canada and Australia, and one that's unitary, New Zealand. So I wanted to see whether or not, say, federal countries would be more or less likely to have policy change than unitary countries. And I'm not sure anything really totally came out, because in the Australian case, the federal structure really slowed down change. Basically, organized public health advocates got laws adopted in every single state and territory in Australia to keep the e-cigarette market bottled up and at every turn, not allowing them to market, not allowing public use. And that was what was controlled at the provincial level. And it basically just kept things on the under a boil. In Canada, the the provinces actually came to the federal government saying, we need guidance on this e-cigarette issue. It's growing out of control and we need you to do something. So the provincial approach to the federal government stimulated policy change. And in New Zealand, I can't quite tell if it floated one way or the other. Had they had, there were basically some cities that tried to regulate vaping in public spaces before the parliament, but no one who really did that any differently than. I don't think it affected the timing at the federal level. It was moving at the pace it was moving because the bureaucracy was controlling it. On elections, that's more interesting. So the electoral systems in these countries are very different. So let's just focus on what was interesting. In New Zealand, they use a mixed member proportional system where after some frustrations in the 80s and 90s with third parties getting like 20% of the vote and none of the seats in parliament, the government switched to their MMP system, which basically creates the net need for coalition governments. The other part of a New Zealand system is that Maori, or the indigenous people, actually have reserved seats in the parliament. Now, traditionally, they were screwed over in the way that indigenous people typically are, and were given fewer seats than their population merited. That has been slightly redressed in the 90s after the passage of MMP. But what this did, these two features of New Zealand, was it created coalition governments through MMP and then reserve seats for Maori. So what happened was in the early 2000s, an indigenous rights party was founded by a woman named Tariana Turia, who had a huge disagreement with the left-wing government of the day, Helen Clark. And she split off, formed her own party. And then in the next election, Tariana Turia was invited by the right-wing government to join them in coalition and create the government. Now, what that did was it allowed the Maori to say, hey, we have some demands and you got to meet them in order for us to join. And one of those was, you got to make a tobacco control smoke-free 2025 goal. And you got to really recognize that our health disparities matter. We need people to learn our language, et cetera. And so what that did was, it created some path dependence that later on raised the specter of a problem in tobacco control, but it allowed health disparities to actually be featured. And that's just, it's a product of history, and it's a product of elections. And so it's not that the indigenous people, like caring about indigenous issues is the thing that mattered in New Zealand. It's that institutions drove the ability to care about those issues. And I think that understanding where that comes from is really useful if you're trying to say, why is it different? And Canada and Australia have their own whole things, but we could talk about those for later. They're not as interesting.
Great. Thank you very much, and congratulations again.
Thanks.
I want to jump in straight in at this point because my question or comment is, my first one is really related to this idea of pace of change. So I wanted to first interrogate you just a little bit about regulatory stance as a concept, in particular, sort of the connection between regulatory stance and the Kingdon streams, right? Because I feel like as you're talking to us and elaborating, you're hitting on something quite important. There are certain aspects of the regulatory stance or factors that cause the regulatory stance in a country which are more permanent, institutional, are slow to change. And there are other factors which are much quicker to change. And I think a part of really fleshing out this concept going forward from now is nailing that, because I think traditionally theories of public policy do a very bad job of understanding both rapid change and slow change and historical institutionalist factors. So I'd like to hear you say a bit more about the connection between the streams and the regulatory stance, but also it's kind of coming from a place for me where you're going to use this policy hopefully to not just inform academics, but also in a translational capacity to inform policymakers. So what advice, I guess this is my second question, what advice could you give to a policymaker, given that some of those factors will be beyond their control, they will be institutional, they will be about big, as you said in your example, access of a population to adequate representation kinds of factors, big picture things, and some smaller picture things around more rapidly changing public opinion or other bits of evidence, which is the kind of thing that we see now with the coronavirus pandemic. So two questions. I guess the theoretical part is, can you say something about the balance between less quickly changing factors and more rapidly changing factors? And then how would you translate your findings to an audience of policymakers specifically?
So thank you for that. That's a good thought to work through. So let me work out loud. So
this meeting is okay.
yeah, so institutional factors are going to shape what's possible for a regulatory stance in the largest sense. So when I was showing how regulatory frameworks are set out, that there are different pathways that are carved and that that similarly situated products can run through. Now, that's the product of old and slow institutions that took forever to build. So, you know, the creation of an idea of a therapeutic good and how that has to work, that actually dictates what options are available to a bureaucrat at any particular point. They can basically reassign a particular market to an existing change if that's within their power. Those are like the slow and important instances that are important. And so Australia had one of those particular decisions, but the slow institutional factors of how do you, it was around reclassifying nicotine liquid as not a poison. But the slow institutional factors of defining what a poison was and the process of sorting through that evidence, that was something that the advocates who were for change never were able to change, and they were roundly defeated. And so they then had to turn to the political process to try to find their change rather than a bureaucracy. So I think that understanding how a regulatory stance is operationalized in the, I guess the status quo, is about understanding the slow factors, is about understanding how is the playing field laid out for a product and similarly situated products and a product in, say, substitute markets, and understanding how those decisions are made probably determines how the regulatory stance is adopted. Change has a lot more to do with fast factors like politics, public opinion, and evidence. And so I think that the regulatory stances theory is it's shaped in the short term by fast factors and in the long run by slow factors. And I'd say that. So what advice do I give to policymakers about how to use the regulatory stances concept? So I think it's particularly useful to question why people take a particular position and whether they are comfortable with the implications of what they are doing. So I think that it's useful to pin someone down and ask, are you comfortable with growing this market? Are you comfortable with shrinking this market? Why are you comfortable with growing the market for marijuana? Why are you not comfortable with shrinking the market for alcohol? Why are you comfortable with growing the market for solar and not for geothermal energy? I think it's useful in a translational capacity because it allows you to put your stances together and maybe try to rationalize them or interrogate them and see if there's logic that goes with it. Secondly, it is useful to evaluate how a performance in a translational sense. So I stick with tobacco control here. The progress made on tobacco control is great, and it's a great lesson, but like the tobacco market only peaked in size in the US in terms of real dollars in 2006. It was 40 years after the anti-smoking movement had began, and I thought, well, it couldn't have been that long. And in terms of if you add up all the different kinds of tobacco products sold in the US, that didn't peak until about 2016. So if you're evaluating how you're doing regulating a market that you've determined to be harmful to health, it should be contracting. And looking at that overall metric and comparing yourself to, say, some sort of ideal is what the regulatory stances concept really allows you to tackle. Because you can say, am I comfortable with taking policy action that doesn't accomplish this goal that I state that I want and that I would really like to achieve? And so I think it brings up lots of hairy questions, but I think they're hairy questions I want to dig into and to figure out why does one advocacy group or policymaker or politician want to take a particular position, and have they thought through those consequences? And if so, how do they like come to that idea? Why is that okay? And I just really want to go deeper and explore different places, markets, times with that.
That's great. I'm going to turn my video on because I realized I'm nodding while you were talking. So I just wanted to comment on that further, and then I'm going to go back to the committee and then to the whole group of people in the room. Please do listen back to what you just said when you get the recording of this, because I think that was a nice formulation of the value of you providing, talking about regulatory stances, but then building that on Kingdon. You've already talked about the strengths of Kingdon in terms of flexibility, and Daniel's been helpful in, and Scott, in drilling into some of the things you have to make crystal clear in terms of the comparability of Kingdon across places and time. But I think then the regulatory stances part adds something definitively, because it is both translational, so it's helping to assist in that comparison, and it's also a diagnostic tool. I liked that your function for the concept. So it's translational in the context of assisting comparison. It's going to be something that I think organizations interested in tobacco control policy can use and operationalize in order to look at data across time and countries and place. But I also think it's diagnostic in the context of the holistic nature of the stance. Is you're not just framing your research project based on one agency or one part of government or one government action. I think increasingly comparison has to pay attention to whole of government. And so I really like this concept for its contribution in that regard, which is something that comparative politics needs, and it's something that public policy needs too. Okay, I'm going to go back to the rest of the committee just to see if any of this dislodged any more questions.
None for me, thanks.
Yeah, I'm fine, thanks.
Okay.
I'm happy.
Okay, great. I think just looking at this nice audience, I think it would be lovely if we could open the discussion just a little and allow people in the audience to chime in. So bear with me. You feel free, I think, in particular, to put things in the chat. That's probably the most efficient way. So I'm gonna go there, and I'm gonna start reading some questions. Okay, if you could consider one more country, which fourth country would you pick?
Okay, that's a good one, Ryan. I think I would like to talk about, if I had to add one more, it would be really hairy and I'd have to go learn some language, but I would probably want to go learn about Switzerland. It's sitting in the middle of the EU. It also left a prohibitionist stance and has ended up somewhere around contractionist in its stance towards the market. And this is relatively recent. Essentially, Switzerland is not in the EU, but it has really hairy relationships with the tobacco industry, being that Philip Morris International and Japan Tobacco have their international headquarters in the country. I would love to go figure out why on earth they decided to be so harsh, so much more harsh on e-cigarettes than cigarettes. At least that's how I think that's their policy is coming out. And I want to see how that coalition works. I know Swiss politics is really messy, and I have very little of an intro into it. But it matches as a weird fourth case because it ended up so differently. And I want to see how you end up not at expansion, but at this decision to, we would like this market to not be there, but we don't want it to be nothing.
That's great, thank you. And Ryan's replying to say, very thoughtful answer, awesome job, and he thinks the industry dimension would be really interesting to unwrap.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course. Ken was saying he has a question that he would like to go through out loud. And it's great to have you here, Ken. Take it away.
Thanks. A terrific job, Alex, and congratulations. I will fumble with this one, but I found it absolutely fascinating when you were talking about the contrast between Australia and New Zealand, because they're such close neighbors, and they have so much in common in many ways. If I heard you correctly, you're basically attributing the change in New Zealand to the fact that they had established a smoke-free goal, an end game, basically. Australia hasn't done that. Australia also has the poisons legislation, which I believe that New Zealand doesn't. So in one sense, the Australia situation was really constrained from moving forward. They'd have to overcome something. And in the other sense, they were feeling, in New Zealand, they were feeling a little more desperate because of the high smoking rates among the Maoris. I'm trying to understand whether there's some good generalizations here. And in particular, the end game goal is fascinating, if that's a motivator here. The Aussies had a fairly low rate of smoking, but interestingly, from the best data we have, that has not decreased much in the last several years, whereas it has, the low smoking rates have decreased in the UK and the US and other places where you see e-cigarettes more prominent. But so when I said, Holly, I was going to fumble with this, that's exactly what I'm doing. I don't know how to phrase this. I'm not even sure it's a question, but can you reflect a little bit more on the contrast between Australia and New Zealand and the radically different positions they've arrived at?
Yeah, and Ken, that's it's sticky what you're getting at, because the difference between Australia and New Zealand is not much. They both have implemented tobacco control policies that are the strongest in the world. Like, they've literally done everything the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control has asked of them and more. Cigarettes cost $25 a pack in both countries, and they don't make more money than Americans do. Just cigarettes are crazy expensive, and they've done everything. The difference, I'd say, is not the actual effectiveness of tobacco control policy in either country, because studies are showing that little by little, these tobacco control interventions are working, and they're slowly chipping away at the market and whoever in the smoking population. The difference is the perceived failure. And so New Zealand has become frustrated with their lack of perceived progress. And the Maori situation made it all the worse. But the existence of an endgame goal also highlighted how they were falling short. So I sort of kept the perceived failure of tobacco control as the problem that really got things going, because objectively, New Zealand isn't doing worse than Australia. Australia is not. I actually would take issue. I don't think they're doing worse than the US or the UK or anyone else. They all have smoking prevalence rates among adults around 14%. Theirs are down about 20% from about 10 years ago. Like, it's working, or from about 5 years ago. It's working, and all at about the same pace. So it's basically has frustration built up, has a willingness to question the status quo built up. Now, the existence and work of your good friend Murray Logison in New Zealand likely also helped forward the prominence of e-cigarettes due to some, of the historical accidents that, like, the first e-cigarette company came to Murray and said, hey, could you test these out? And then Murray was a credible guy to sort of lead a little scientific community in New Zealand that was more interested in understanding e-cigarettes than keeping them out of the country. So he helped possibly shape the growing dissatisfaction with the status quo, but I'd say the problem that we identified was much more amorphous than truly doing worse than somebody else. It's a perception.
Thank you.
That's wonderful, thank you. So does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask out loud or ask in the chat? I don't hear or see any at this point. So what I'm going to do is thank you so much, Alex, for bearing with us through all this. Well done. I'm going to create a small breakout room for the committee members. We'll just have our final chat briefly, and then we'll get back to you and everybody else in the main room. So do bear with me while I do that, committee members.
Do you see the button to do that, Holly?
Okay, committee members, you should see breakout room 2, which you should be able to join. Lovely.
Holly, would you unmute everyone once you guys leave? That'd be all right? Nope. Okay. I guess everyone can unmute if you'd like.
Great job, Alex.
Awesome
Thanks,
job,
Michael.
love.
Thank you.
Yay.
Yay.
Woo, you did it. It's over. Yeah, good job.
Thanks everyone for joining. It was really nice to see everyone.
You did good. Oh, I was hiding behind.
I am curious about regional variation in other countries, just since we talk about it so much in the US, but I didn't know whether to bring it up or not.
You mean subnational stuff would be fascinating to do too, because you could do the same thing in Canada and the US and a little in Australia too. So if you want to work on that, Kara, I'm down.
No.
I'm waiting to see what the impact on COVID will be with e-cigarettes in these two places, given that New Zealand is like the most contained of all, and that there's this thought that e-cigarettes are a contributor to the younger crowd and their outcomes. I don't know.
I'm not buying that. I've been looking into that. I'm not buying that conclusion just yet. But I mean, I think the connection between this and COVID was that the bureaucrats in all of my stories did a really good job. They were super thorough. They knew their science. They had politicians who wanted to work with them. And like, Canada wasn't perfect. New Zealand was about as close to perfect as you could be. And Australia did a great job too. Like, it didn't matter right wing, left wing. Like, you just needed to have a government that wanted to listen to its bureaucracy about public health. And like, the bureaucrats said different things in different places, but like, they had people who wanted to listen. Just cool.
It's a little sad that that's a very profound finding right now.
Isn't it?
It sounds kind of profound.
It's
Actually,
like the least you could do.
A response to Michael Rubin's question. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but there is an emerging literature that suggests that smokers are protected against COVID.
Really?
And yes, if you take a good look at the data, and this is both Western and Eastern countries, smokers are disproportionately underrepresented in the COVID positives. If you look at those who are hospitalized, they do worse. The smoker who ends up in the hospital does worse than the non-smoker on average. But the proportion of people who get to the hospital is very low for smokers, and it's an odd issue. I don't have the scientific background to understand it particularly, but some people are saying that nicotine has a protective effect. One of the scientists in a group that I sit on, a listserv, said that it may be that smokers are inhaling hot gases constantly. It's a very interesting issue.
Oh, so it kills the virus because it adds to signal.
Maybe.
So,
who knows?
I looked this up for a presentation actually, and it has to do with nicotine binding to ACE2 inhibitors and things of that sort. And that's how they theorize that it gets into the body. This was actually a theory way back in China during the first SARS outbreak, that they thought nicotine was protective. So then there was a lot more people smoking more or starting smoking, and they were trying to see if it had any value, but it has to do with nicotine's interaction with the receptors that bind to the virus itself. So I don't know if we have any information, and we have information on smokers, but not on vapors who are also intaking nicotine. But since a lot of people in the hospital aren't asking about that, we don't have good data. So it'll be really interesting to see if that has any real merit to it. This is lasting a lot longer than the SARS outbreak initially in 2003. So we'll see.
By no means is your all-cause mortality improved by taking up smoking.
Well, that's the worry. I mean, the worry is that this is an excuse for smokers to keep smoking. And if it turns out it's just nicotine, there are other ways to get nicotine in their systems. If it's hot gases, smoking is probably one of the better ways. Vaping might do it. It's something we clearly need to understand, but I am concerned about that this may encourage people not to quit. I expect to see smoking sales of cigarettes go up, at least in the US during this period.
What great irony that we would actually have smoking as a medicinal recommendation for coronavirus.
So, Michael, I actually have one of the three diseases that smoking is protective against. So I have ulcerative colitis, and it's just irony of ironies. One of the things that had I taken up smoking, I would have better outcomes for that particular thing.
Wow.
Same thing with
Bizarre.
Parkinson's.
Are we
Really?
totally sure? Are we totally sure that this research on the beneficial aspects of smoking was not indirectly funneled by, funded by Philip Morris?
Definitely, we're quite sure of that. There's lots of it. You can take a look in the literature, you'll find lots of it, and you'll find review articles. Now, there's so many of these papers out that there have been reviews both in Asia and in the West on this. It seems to be a real phenomenon. The question is why. There could be underreporting of smoking behavior. That's certainly a possibility. There are lots of smokers may not show up in the hospital, may just get sick and stay home. We just don't know what the final story is here, but it's not Philip Morris. Much as I like to believe that about everything negative associated with smoking.
Yeah, it's real.
It's fascinating because they were calling it the smoking cure in China. That was what they were saying, and that was what was getting spread around. So the way that media is interacting with this too is very interesting.
Yeah, I was going to comment earlier that any health benefits going to require some very careful messaging that I'm sure will be botched by the media.
Yeah, this has definitely been a lesson in nuance in public messaging. Has a long way to go. Like political campaigns who figured they could micro-target, young suburban moms with an interest in yoga and give them a different message than like anyone else. Like the experience with vaping and risk communication really shows we are terrible at that. And we are very bad at getting wires crossed because we can't even give kids and adults a different message. So.
Hey, folks.
Here's Holly's back.
Hey, committee.
Us committee members are back. Let me just make sure everybody is here. I see Scott. I think I see everybody. Yep. So we've had our deliberation, and I'm very happy to tell you that we have decided to pass your dissertation with minor substantive revisions. So let me have the greatest pleasure of all, which is to say congratulations, Dr. Liber. Thank you so much for writing a wonderful dissertation. The committee were very, very appreciative of your work. And let's all unmute ourselves and have some applause and noise because it's weird doing it silently. So.
Yeah.
Burning question on everybody's lips is, what are you going to be doing to celebrate this momentous occasion?
Well, we're having the Atlanta family over for a barbecue. I'm doing my specialty brisket. And then I think we're going to have a Liber Brookfield family Zoom call tonight. So, and I think Lindsay is going and picking up sushi burritos for lunch. So
that sounds wonderful.
You're not going to the beach, Alex, in a crowded space to get 2 feet away from people?
I guess not. No, Hilton Head apparently is just infested right now. So yeah.
I hear it's so safe.
I wish.
Don't celebrate by forgetting to physical distance from people that you should distance from. So, a point of technicality, Scott and I will be responsible for the paperwork. We will also draft a memo for you, Alex, that lets you know 2 columns of things. The minor things that we would like you to do in terms of revising the dissertation for final submission to Rackham. And I think you have good time to do that. And then we're going to have a second column, which is broader suggestions for developing the dissertation and moving it forward to publication. So you'll see that from me. And then we'll submit the paperwork that we have to do otherwise straight to Caitlin, so you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Just go and enjoy yourself. Congratulations again. It is a wonderful moment. I'm so happy, and I'm nearly crying. And Charlie knows about this because I really did cry in her dissertation defense also. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you as a PhD student in our program and to have you as my advisee It's been wonderful working with you this time. I am so looking forward to you being my colleague in the future and to seeing where you go, because you are going to do fantastic things, Alex Liber. You're a wonderful scholar, and I'm very proud of you, even though I only had a small role in your success. So congratulations.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you, everyone. Like, you made this possible. All of you. Thank you. So
Congratulations.
thanks, Paula.
Congratulations, Alex.
There you go, bud.
Daniel. Thanks, Brady. So
Congratulations.
I hope everyone has a really great day and stays safe, and thank you for joining. So I'm happy to answer any questions. If you want to see the whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle, just ask. I'll share. There's a lot. So
I'm going to leave the room open for a few more minutes. I might pop away and pop back just in case anyone wants to say hi to anybody, because sometimes some of you guys don't see each other very often. So the formal part of this meeting is over. Let the celebrations begin. I will be back in a moment, and I'll just leave this room open a little bit if you guys want to chat. But thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
thanks.
Hi, Alex.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Really proud of you.
Bye-bye.
Congratulations, Dr. Liber.
Thank you.
You like
Congrats,
this
Alex.
Hi, Dr. Liber.
Oh, yeah,
Congrats,
Alex. That feels good. So, oh boy. So, all right. What's everybody else up to? How's the bubs?
She's doing good. I was just wondering if you guys want to, if someone wants to press stop.